Hi, and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything that's happening in public policy and politics. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal, bringing you this show every week to let you know what's going on here in North Carolina's capital and everything we're seeing happening in your state government. Joining us this week on the couches, we have David Larson, Carolina Journal's opinion editor, and of course, political reporter David Bass, and political reporter Alex Baltzegar, and plus Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation. Thanks for joining us. Make sure you like and follow this show. We're going to be bringing it to you every week with the latest of what's happening in downtown Raleigh. This week, North Carolina was named for the second year in a row best state for business in the nation. But here's the thing, who gets credit? That's been a big fight this week. We've been following all of it. Plus, the architect of North Carolina's COVID response has been sworn in at the federal level. And bad data seems to be circulating about opportunity scholarships. And we have the latest from the state legislature. Okay, that's a lot to cover. Let's jump right in. David Larson, let's talk about you. Best for business for North Carolina. That's pretty good news.
Second year in a row. So
okay.
It's something to celebrate, as you know, the state is being noticed around the country as a great place to do business.
Sure.
And CNBC brought in our governor, Governor Roy Cooper, a Democrat, to talk about that. And sometimes it felt a little bit like, you know, if a group won the science fair and then they want to talk to the kid who didn't really show up to the meetings that much, because a lot of the things they're celebrating were things that he had fought, lowering taxes and regulations and
sure.
things like that. And a lot of the interview, he sort of spent criticizing the Republicans who had sort of made this possible. We have a clip of that.
Yeah, sure. It's a kind of an abbreviated version, but here's the short lines of what Governor Cooper had to say on national television.
You're telling the country that we don't want certain people, and that's bad for business. I believe in North Carolina we're going to be able to come around. We have not gone as far as a lot of the other states. Right now we're in the middle of a session and a budget process that's going to be really important here.
I mean, have you heard from companies that are actually thinking now of leaving as a result of all of this, or is it just something that you're worried about?
And you know, North Carolina went through this with the bathroom bill back in 2016. Now, don't you think you're seeing businesses leave a state, even like Florida and Texas, where there have been oppressive culture war legislation passed? I do, though, believe that it matters in development of new businesses, the kinds of innovative businesses that North Carolina wants to attract.
You've now declared a state of emergency in the schools. First of all, what does that mean? And second of all, is that going to be a long-term competitiveness issue, that the schools aren't going to be as good as they've been up till now?
Look, we work with the legislature in making real investments in community colleges and universities, and I think we're in lockstep on most of those issues. But North Carolina has, for generations, and certainly for the past few decades, recognized that long-term a great workforce depends on early childhood education, quality child care, and good K-12 public schools. Right now, you're seeing Republicans begin the process of shortchanging the public schools, putting more money in unaccountable private school vouchers, not putting enough in early childhood education and child care. You top that off with the potential for legislation, which hasn't passed yet, that put culture wars in our classroom. I think all of those things come together to say, look, we're in a state of emergency here. You're telling...
All right, you saw there Governor Cooper talking a bit about, you know, some of the problems he sees, even though we're first, that, you know, I think he mentioned Florida and Texas, that they also have some of those same issues with inclusion, with education.
He focused on culture wars a lot.
He focused on culture wars a lot. And to his credit, the interviewer said, well, we haven't really seen anybody leave, have we?
Right.
On all these things they're trying to say are bad for business. And
right.
And Cooper's like, yes, that's true. Also in Florida and Texas, doesn't seem like people are leaving there.
Right.
But look towards the long term, maybe that's where we're going to see these things have an impact.
Is he creating this as part of his messaging?
I think actually somewhat this dynamic about these culture war things is built into the CNBC's the way they weight it. So, for example, Florida had the #1. They rated things like economy,
right.
business friendliness,
sure.
and then they had a category that was sort of life and inclusion. It's sort of a DEI type category.
Okay.
But Florida and Texas were #1 and #2 in the economy category, which was, if you can put up, there's a thing of the weightedness. So
sure.
on there, 14 0.4% was for economy, which seems pretty important to business. And then right under that, the life and inclusion one is about the same, 14%.
They weighted the same.
Yeah, about the same. And so that really hurt some states. They made a big deal that Texas is no longer in the top 5. They dropped to number 6.
Okay.
And that's because they were number 50 in that life and inclusion one because of an abortion bill, because of LGBTQ things, including not having biological males be in women's sports.
Sure.
So they dinged states to that degree to where Texas had the number 2 economy, Florida had the number 1, but both of them were pushed down. They're still in the top 10, but pushed way down. And they're celebrating Minnesota, whose economy was middling and business friendliness was 39th, but they had, they were top in this inclusion thing. So it's somewhat arbitrary in that it seems like a category meant to lift up some more progressive states.
Sure.
And so, Governor Cooper was happy to play along with that and focus most of the interview on how we didn't do well and Texas and Florida didn't do well in this sort of
that must have meant our
arbitrary.
Economy was remarkable to be number 1 given that criteria.
Oh, we had great in workforce
Sure.
and business friendliness and all kinds of things like that economy. So we were great in those, but we were 34th in that life and inclusion one because of things like
interesting.
The sports bill and our abortion bill, things like that pushed us way down. So you find a lot of these conservative states still rank in the top 10. Georgia, Tennessee, Virginia, which isn't quite a red state, but those were kind of the top few were all red states that were getting dinged for that.
Very interesting. Now, one of the things, he really took advantage of that national platform to take a swipe at opportunity scholarships and charter schools and school choice. I noticed that, but that seems to be part of his MO, his talking points for this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to see what Cooper's doing since, especially he's lost the veto power, basically, with the changeover of the supermajorities. Is like he's really trying to use his bully pulpit. And every time there's always mention the opportunity scholarship program, school choice. So yeah, it is interesting that even in the atmosphere of trying to talk about obviously the LGBTQ issues, the abortion bill and everything, and then lumping education in there as well and saying we're trying to spend all this money on vouchers when we should be doing a better job of funding public schools.
Is that where the majority of North Carolinians are? Do they share that view, or are they more pro-school choice?
Absolutely pro-school choice. I think recent polling for years and decades now has shown people favor school choice. Nationally, there was a poll that just came out this week that showed that it was over 70% of people support school choice, including minorities and Democrats as well. So it's not it's controversial only in the sense of like there's a small minority of people who don't like it.
But
most people like it. So.
Very interesting. Now, what was the legislature's response to this? They had to object because they've been working for a decade to get some of these things through.
Yeah, that's right. And real quick, the bully pulpit, I think this might have been a Freudian slip by Cooper, but he actually says himself in this interview that he's been using his bully pulpit, and then he pivots, because I think he catches himself saying that. He pivots to talking about how he's using his bully pulpit to invite people and businesses into the state. So I think he was going a different direction. Then he caught himself saying bully pulpit.
Right. Well, I mean, but there have been some objections there from the legislature to how he's been handling.
That's right.
Took advantage of a national platform for 15 minutes.
Absolutely. And this, it is funny to your point that they picked Cooper to be the spokesperson for North Carolina and basically giving him the credit, and then he kind of takes the credit in the first couple minutes of that interview.
Sure.
But yeah, I thought that was interesting. So I reached out to Speaker Tim Moore to see what his perspective was on that, if he felt like Cooper deserved all this credit.
Right.
And Speaker Moore said pretty much what I thought he was going to say, is that Cooper was in opposition with the legislature on a lot of these things, a lot of these policies, a lot of this Republican plan since they've taken over to lower and reduce regulations, to lower taxes in the state and create a friendlier business environment. Cooper was opposed to the legislature on a lot of these issues.
Sure.
And Speaker Moore said that. Senator Phil Berger also put out a statement about that. Do we have that one up?
Senate Leader Berger had a statement he put out saying similar to the same thing. They did say that they gave him credit for going out and recruiting businesses to North Carolina and being a good spokesperson in that way, talking people into coming on back. But Berger said something similar to what Moore said.
Yeah, that's right. And see it here on the screen.
Yeah. It is interesting, that interview we were just talking about. He spent I guess he got probably 15 minutes on national television and prime time on CNBC. Here's a breakdown of what that interview, the path it took. He spent a little bit of time. He spent the first, few minutes praising North Carolina just after the reporter package that talked about how great North Carolina was. If you get a chance to watch this, go to YouTube, find CNBC, watch the whole interview. It really is valuable because it make you feel good first. It's a great place to live, and we all knew that. It's nice to see it on a national stage. He spent about a minute and a half or so saying how great North Carolina is, and then spent 7.5 minutes talking about how bad the legislature is. I was surprised at that breakdown.
It was interesting, and I think he's sort of priming the national audience for North Carolina falling in these rankings because, as David was mentioning, North Carolina, the Republicans have a supermajority in the legislature, and there are some bills that CNBC is not going to like.
Okay.
They're not going to bode well for their little inclusion rankings.
Sure.
And Cooper doesn't like them, and
Sure.
so I do think North Carolina probably will see a lower ranking next time around.
Oh, interesting. How valuable do you think these rankings are as we go through public policy things and trying to attract business to North Carolina?
They aren't necessarily going to make a major difference. The two things I noted most about this are one, that Governor Cooper last year did this major interview from the coast.
Sure.
This year he's in the mountains. So if we win next year, he'll have to find somewhere in the middle of the state
Right.
to talk about it.
Perhaps the General Assembly.
Yeah. The other thing that would be very appropriate. But the other thing is, we talked about Governor Cooper and whether he deserves credit for this. For good or for bad,
Right.
when a state performs well or poorly, it's the governor who gets credit. Just like when the national economy, regardless of whether the president had much to do with it or not, it's the president who gets the praise or the blame. That's what's going to happen with Cooper, and he's taking advantage of it, even though, as the panel has said, he has been largely against the things that help North Carolina's economy. He's been against lowering tax rates, getting rid of the regulatory burden, expanding school choice, enabling more opportunities for everyone. He's been against all of those things, has been for the things that North Carolina did 30 or 40 years ago because the big government and union type people wanted them to do those things.
Sure.
He's been against the innovations that the General Assembly has been focusing on for more than a decade now.
And the governor in North Carolina is particularly weak compared to other states too, and I think that's context that perhaps the national media misses.
Oh, interesting.
But in North Carolina political circles, I think Senate Leader Phil Berger is widely regarded as the most powerful lawmaker in the state.
Very
even
interesting.
more so than the governor, and then most people would list the speaker after that, and then maybe the governor third.
Right.
The governor's even more weak when there's a supermajority in the
Sure.
opposing party in the legislature.
Exactly.
Do you think this is part of Cooper's, trying to get himself into his next career phase on a national platform?
It could be, yeah. He's been a lot more in the media, and I think part of it is the lame duck thing.
Sure.
There's not much else he can do other than get his message out, see if that can bring some pressure on the legislature if he can't do it, through his veto pen or other ways.
Right.
And also, yes, I think, he wants his name out there a bit. He's actually a fairly, for a Democrat in North Carolina, he actually polls fairly well. So,
Right.
Maybe his advisors would think he could be a good eventual, vice presidential
He's got the
candidate or higher.
national talking points for Democrats as opposed to the North Carolina talking points for Democrats. Very interesting. We'll be following this, particularly as North Carolina starts passing, legislation or overriding vetoes of his that fit into that category of those culture wars that he's focused so heavily on. Now let's move on a little bit, Alex. I'm going to come right back to you. Let's talk about the legislature. It's been kind of a slow week, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
It's been a very slow week in terms of actually doing things.
Sure.
A lot of the lawmakers are out taking a break, they're on vacation, and the House actually had some override votes scheduled this week.
Okay.
They were going to override Cooper's veto. I think there were 4 or 5 bills they were going to override him on, but I believe that they did not have enough people there to feel comfortable with an override vote, because you do need 3/5
Right.
of the chamber. So I think they didn't feel comfortable with that, so they pushed it to next week.
Okay.
So we are expecting override votes next week. But yeah, because a lot of people are gone, like we were just talking about.
Sure.
There's not a lot going on actually in the building. There are some negotiations going on behind closed doors. I'm sure they're in talks. The budget process has stalled significantly.
What are you hearing about that?
So I'm hearing that at earliest, the budget will probably come out mid-August or so.
Oh, wow.
And, way back when, we were talking about it coming out maybe mid-June and then
Yeah.
being out of here by June 30th, and that's just...
Every year we try for that, right? Every year.
It hasn't happened in a while. So we'll see on that front if things keep getting delayed. I know that the Senate is really prioritizing their tax package, where they're planning on some more tax cuts. I think the House is giving them some pushback on that.
Okay.
I think NC Innovation has potentially gotten wrapped up in some of these negotiations.
Right.
But yeah, we'll see what happens with the budget.
Very interesting. Mitch, what are your thoughts on this?
One reason we're seeing a delay in the final deal on a budget is something that will actually celebrate its 7th anniversary tomorrow.
Okay.
And that is the budget bill that was passed in 2016 and was signed into law by Governor Pat McCrory, outgoing Governor Pat McCrory, on July 14th of 2016, was a bill that included a provision that said, if you don't have a new state budget at the end of the 2-year budget plan, the old budget remains in effect. In the past, when we got to the end of a 2-year budget, if there was no budget deal, there was a lot of panic about, is state government going to shut down? Are people going to get their paychecks? Are people going to get all of these services that they were expecting? And so that really got people in the mode of, let's get a deal. And so there would either be a temporary plan that would last for a couple of weeks until they got a final deal, or they would rush to get the final deal done.
Right.
Now there's no incentive to do that. And in fact, if you are, like some of the leading legislators are, fiscal conservatives, it doesn't really bother you that you aren't going to endorse a new spending increase with the new budget. You're fine with budget levels staying as they are, and that's something that has been playing a role in recent years and certainly has to be playing at least some role this year.
Sure, very interesting.
That's some context to that is the federal government does not have this.
Right.
And so what they have to do is they have to literally pass something like a continuing resolution in order to continue their budget and their funding. So it doesn't have the same sort of effect. So here it does force people to work something out.
So one of those veto overrides got pushed off is the Parents' Bill of Rights. Governor Cooper vetoed it. The legislature is expected to override it, but who knows? Maybe they don't have the votes. This week, SB 90 was kind of floated as a committee substitute that incorporates some of those Parents' Bill of Rights things. Have you heard much about this? What was the pushback on this and what it has?
Yeah, it kind of dropped fairly suddenly where, on Twitter there was a huge explosion of outrage, over this
Yeah, we saw
bill coming
Colin
together.
Campbell going after the bill writers for its provisions on libraries and public school libraries.
Yeah, basically saying you can't get a budget together, but we're gonna,
we're gonna
run
go
with
after
this
librarians,
right? Yeah, so yeah, it does. It contains a lot of the provisions of the Parents' Bill of Rights. So it's gonna be really interesting to see how that plays out in the coming weeks, just in terms of moving that forward. But it does indicate. I wonder if there is some issue with perhaps keeping the veto override vote together on that. Although they've been remarkably consistent on it so far in terms of keeping everyone together.
I think they've got a clean sweep right now. Is that right? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So this SB 90 has things like it allows parents to request a reassignment, and it requires schools to have a detailed syllabus ahead of the semester starting. Things that I would have thought would be a given, that you can have your kid's syllabus before the class starts. Those things really aren't a part of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of things that are being painted as extreme and, why are they putting all this out there to a lot of people, you'll see in polling, it seems very typical. And to speak to Colin Campbell's tweet, he's talking about libraries, that's actually become a really big issue for a lot of people. You'll see at school board meetings, but also at, town council meetings or things like that on public libraries, that people are kind of upset about the politicization of another institution where they feel like libraries are being used to sort of bring in books that'll influence people.
Is this a national trend? Yeah.
Yeah, Montana just this week announced that they're going to back out of the American Library Association, and Wyoming, their neighbors, thinking about it. And a part of it is their president now of the American Library Association had some tweet that she said she's a Marxist lesbian and she wants to queer the catalog of that was her main
of public libraries.
Of public libraries.
Oh.
And so some people just see that as that's not really your role. We just want a place to bring our kids and read some books. And so while that seems sort of, why are they messing with libraries? There is kind of a lot bubbling under the surface, another culture war kind of
Very interesting. I didn't really realize that was happening in our library system.
And I've been to Wake County public libraries recently, and first thing when I walked in is a kids LGBT section.
A kids?
A bunch of
interesting.
LGBTQ type of books for children. And I know Wake County Public Library, the system, had this event for Pride Month recently where they had like a trans story hour, drag queen story hour type of thing. And
Interesting.
yeah.
All right. Well, we'll be certainly watching that pretty closely. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is this expansion of opportunity scholarships. Has gotten a lot of attention, especially from those who want to stop it. Tell me about this report that came out that had some questionable data. You had a great breakdown, a story on CarolinaJournal.com that says do your homework, because that's kind of a directive that when you're gonna start criticizing schools, you better have your numbers right.
Yeah, and we have I think the picture up
Yeah,
there.
there's Bob.
Locke's very own Bob Lubke there had a quote in the story basically just saying, do your homework if you're going to review these numbers.
Okay.
So basically what happened was the North Carolina Justice Center, left-wing think tank, had put out a report where they took two sets of data with regard to the Opportunity Scholarship Program that basically shouldn't be compared, but they compared them, and then from that deduced that there was widespread fraud going on within the Opportunity Scholarship Program. So they identified around 60 schools where they said there were more students enrolled who were receiving opportunity scholarships than were actually the entire student body enrollment. So
That's a strong accusation.
So they're basically saying these schools are accepting fictitious students in order to pocket some of that opportunity scholarship funding.
Wow.
But again, the data they were comparing, the one report from the Department of Non-Public Instruction was old, dated information. It hasn't been updated in a few years. And then they were comparing it with another set of data that is updated. So just from the vantage point of being a good journalist going and looking at that data, you need to find that out. But they published it, ran with the story, and they really got the headline that they wanted, which was widespread fraud and school choice program in North Carolina, and it got picked up across the country.
Sure.
But the context of the actual, you're not supposed to be comparing those two numbers as, doesn't get that headline.
Yeah.
So.
Speaking of doing their homework, David did. I think a good part of his story was he actually called one of these schools and said, "Why don't these numbers? Why don't these numbers match up?" And they said, "Well, that was our enrollment during COVID," and they took that and then compared it to how many scholarships, opportunity scholarships we got this year.
So they took 2020 or 2021 numbers
data,
and compared it to the number that they had today, but said they were the same year.
Exactly. And another thing I found interesting about that was a majority low-income African-American school.
Okay.
And that's traditionally a voting bloc within the Democratic Party, but the anti-school choice people continually are calling them out. So they called out this school, but they also called out one in Durham, Mount Zion Christian Academy, because they have Christian practices there, and they were just kind of mocking their Christian practices. The Justin Parmenter, who's a big teachers union NCIE guy, he's always on there doing that. But so in the polling that David mentioned earlier, actually the group that had the highest support for school choice was black residents, had 73%, and so it was. It seems like a growing rift maybe within the coalition on the left, in that they're trying to say this is bad news. It's going to hurt especially low-income people and minorities, and a lot of people in the black community are not buying that messaging. And they're actually in Georgia this week. They had Misha Minor, representative Democrat, who voted for school choice and got called out, and she was like, "I'm just going to become a Republican because I'm so tired of this trying to pigeonhole me as I can't be for school choice. This is actually what the people in my district are calling for." And she has a low-income African-American district in urban Atlanta. So it's something that across the country is seeing kind of a rift there.
Sure. And one of the first people to welcome her to the Republican Party was North Carolina's own Tricia Cotham, who had a similar story.
Right. Now, school choice, could that be sort of the Achilles heel for the Democrats?
It really does seem to be something where they seem to be very out of tune with the population at large, including a big portion of their own base. That school choice is popular regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. To me, this NC Justice Center story, some might be surprised to hear me say this, but I have zero problem with them looking at the Opportunity Scholarship Program and trying to find issues where it's not working, where it's not fraud. That's a watchdog role that think tanks do.
Yeah.
But you got to get it right.
Yeah.
If you are skewing the numbers, or if you don't understand the numbers, either one of those possibilities could be true in this case.
Sure.
You're going to be shooting yourself in the foot. If you're going to be attacking this program, make sure you get the right numbers and that you aren't letting your ideological bias against choice influence the way your report comes out.
That's an important point, because while it doesn't come out of the actual education budget, it's taxpayer money, and keeping an eye on it is an important part of that. Are you hearing that in the legislature too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think there's a lot of interest in overseeing taxpayer money.
Sure.
And so if there were real problems with this program, and there could be, people are welcome to investigate it and look into it. But I definitely think that lawmakers would have a major interest in knowing about that.
Sure.
But that doesn't delegitimize the program. I think
Right.
you don't
Yes.
see the same energy for other voucher programs that they do like
Oh, true.
with food stamps or with Medicaid or something like that.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
not the same energy, because maybe that would be seen as something that would delegitimize those programs. But they do want to look at this one
Absolutely.
for that purpose.
PPP,
Yeah.
the personal loans that came out during COVID. We're seeing widespread fraud and arrests, particularly Mike Easley's office seems to have an announcement every other day about that. Very interesting. All right, so let's move on. Mitch, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Dr. Mandy Cohen, sworn in this week as head of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. Of course, Dr. Cohen used to be North Carolina's DHHS secretary.
Yeah, and it was certainly interesting. For those of us who were here in North Carolina in 2020, you'll probably remember, and I apologize if this gives anyone PTSD, but you'll probably remember her as the 3 W's woman. And in fact, she recorded a video very early in the COVID pandemic talking about the 3 W's, and we're going to remind you of what she said at that time.
Right. Those are the 3 W PSAs.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Mandy Cohen, Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. Do you know your 3 W's? Wear, wait, wash. Wear a cloth face covering, wait 6 feet apart, wash your hands often, or use hand sanitizer. When you practice your 3 W's, you protect your family and neighbors from COVID-19. We're in this together.
Mandy Cohen really became the face of North Carolina's response to COVID-19, and now that she is taking on this new role as the head of the CDC in Atlanta, and we're going to see some video of her on her first full day on the job, welcoming employees to come into the office there. And I found it interesting that at least some of the people that we'll see were not quite sure what she was doing or who she was or why she was there. But Mandy Cohen going to the CDC is now a reminder of her role as the head of North Carolina's Department of Health and Human Services. And there was an interesting column in CarolinaJournal.com this week from John Hood, the head of the Pope Foundation, talking about, okay, now that Mandy Cohen's in this new role and we're thinking about her again, just how well did North Carolina stack up against the rest of the country when she ran our health department? And he basically concluded we're about average. There were a lot of people that thought that the shutdowns, the lockdowns, the school closures made a great difference in terms of protecting people's health and protecting their lives. And he said if you look at the numbers the way you should, making sure that you adjust for other factors, no, we were about in the middle. North Carolina ranked 27th in terms of the deaths once you adjusted for people's other health conditions. Florida, which was known for being the state that left things open,
wide open,
tried to keep things as open as possible, they were 12th. So Mandy Cohen and all that she did didn't necessarily protect North Carolina as much as her advocates would say that it did. Now, one thing John Hood did mention is that, of course, we took a big economic hit when Governor Cooper and Mandy Cohen shut everything down. John said he thought at the time that hit was going to be longer lasting, but actually North Carolina has bounced back pretty well.
Students haven't, though.
I mean, and that is another thing. So the students, we're still dealing with that, and also we still have the issue of some people who left the workforce during the pandemic who haven't come back, and those who haven't come back have had a higher degree of drug problems and mental health problems. So you still have that to deal with. But if you weigh everything together, North Carolina versus the other states when Mandy Cohen was in charge were about average. So we shouldn't be crowing about how good she was. And those of us on the political right should say that it was terrible, it was the worst state in the country. We basically were about average,
Sure.
which suggests that government doing all of those things didn't really make all that much of a difference. And it would be unfortunate if Mandy Cohen brings that same sort of style of let's have government do much more than it needs to do when she's the head of the CDC.
Very interesting. The collateral damage has been huge, though, right?
Yeah. Well, I did appreciate John's point that, it was kind of mysterious at the time. What is this disease exactly going to do? And he said, we should give a little bit of leeway to, they're trying to figure out, is this about to kill a huge portion of the population?
Sure.
What do we need to do? But on education, I do think we had enough information on that to not have locked down schools as hard as we did.
Right.
Because it was clear that it was a disease that was more affecting people with certain conditions and older as well. So I think they knew early enough, and they that's part of her legacy. I think here that is more negative is that she was more on the side of keeping schools closed, and that did have a long-term impact, not only on the test scores, the learning loss, but on the mental health has been a major problem.
Sure.
Mitch mentioned that with people in the workforce too, but I think an even bigger spike, I believe, has been with teens, just very isolated, some of them using drugs, and a lot of them just having mental health struggles during that time.
Sure, yeah, drug use spiked.
And part of that is Mandy Cohen's fault, and part of it's Roy Cooper's fault, and you have to wonder how much both of them were relying on the teacher union.
Right.
Because basically teachers unions across the country were trying to keep schools closed, and the NCAE, which claims at times that it's not a union and claims at other times that it is, was very much saying keep the schools closed. Right. Governor Cooper, Secretary Cohen were very much on board with the teacher group.
Do you think that the NCAE had an outsized power over the executive branch in North Carolina versus other states, teachers groups?
I would say that's true,
Okay.
And you would compare states that are led by Democratic governors versus ones led by Republican governors. The Democratic Party has become basically in lockstep with NCAE and the NEA because that's where they get their money, and that's one reason why they give them an outsized presence. I think in states like Florida and other states led by Republicans, where it doesn't matter what the teacher union says because they don't like you anyway and they're going to try to vote you out.
Right.
You don't have to listen as much to what they're talking about.
Sure. The impact on students has been huge. I was getting ready, we were talking about this back in the newsroom. 45% of K-12 kids passed their EOGs during the lockdowns. And those kids now, particularly if you look at, in my case, I had a high school freshman during lockdowns who didn't see the inside of her school until the end of sophomore year. She's now applying to colleges. What's going to happen to those kids because the academic damage has been tremendous.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's going to be a long-term issue, going on for years to come with recovering some of the learning losses and the social problems, mental health, substance abuse, like all of that. And I think viewing it just through the narrow lens of the virus and not catching the virus, not dying, all that was one part of the equation. But what they failed to consider was the mental health aspect, the closing the schools, all that. And I think we're really seeing the result, and we're going to for a while. Yeah.
And the NCAE has been acting kind of like an arm of the Democratic Party, and they were advocating strongly in favor of closing schools and keeping kids out of school. And I believe the president of the NCAE, I think her name's Tamika Kelly, tweeted, learning loss is a social construct. And this was in the midst of while they were making
a false
decision.
Construct. Yes, I remember.
That's right. So they've definitely been advocating against that. They've been saying learning loss is not a real thing for a while. I think they've walked some of that back with a lot of the evidence.
That's probably a tweet she regrets, I would imagine.
I think the Democrats' close connection to the NCAE is hurting them, on this topic with parents, but like we said earlier, also with opportunity scholarships and school choice. So maybe that the Democrats will start to rethink if this is, a good partnership to be so in lockstep.
Right. Very interesting. We'll be watching this. So many different things have changed, public policy and political affiliations, all those things. COVID did a lot. We'll be watching and reporting all that to you on carolinajournal.com. Make sure you like and follow, and you'll get the debrief delivered right to you every week, and have a great weekend.